Welcome to Chapter 15 of Traditions and Encounters, the Resurgence of Empire in East Asia. So this chapter really talks about China and its surrounding states, which included Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So the first thing is the restoration of centralized imperial rule in China. So as we recall from the last time, there were the Qin and Han dynasties. And after the Han, there were 350 years of turmoil. So there was lots of fighting going on. But ultimately, it was able to be reunified, and it was done so through the Sui dynasty. So the Sui dynasty was this great new dynasty that came about, and the first thing they did was really start a bunch of construction. So they constructed palaces and granaries, and they even repaired the Great Wall that had started in the Qin dynasty, but had sort of fallen into disrepair. So there were military expeditions as well into Central Asia and Korea, and they also instituted high taxes and compulsory labor services. So of course they wanted to make the people work for them. But the greatest accomplishment was definitely the Great Canal, so this is definitely something important to remember. And the Great Canal was basically this big canal that integrated the economies of the North and South China, so it sort of connected all these regions together. Ultimately, though, the Sui fell because of high taxes and forced labor, and this really created some hate among the people. Also, there were military problems in Korea, so they were trying to invade Korea, but it didn't really work out. Also, there were rebellions that broke out in North China, and that really started to contribute to its fall. So after the Sui dynasty was the Tang dynasty. So this was really when a rebel leader seized Chang'an, which is a city in China, and he established this new city basically. And it was this era of unusual stability and prosperity. And through this, there were extensive networks of transportation and communication, sort of like before. And they instituted this equal field system, which basically was land allotted according to one's needs. So it's kind of like modern day socialism. And they also had bureaucracy of merit through the civil service examinations. So if you had the intellect to pass this exam, you could work in the government. Foreign relations-wise, there was the political theory, so this was also really important at the time, is basically that China was the middle kingdom, or that it was the center of civilization, so everyone else was sort of below them. And as a result, there was also the tributary system, in which surrounding states had to pay tribute to this central kingdom. Ultimately, though, the Tang declined as well because of casual and careless leadership, so the leaders didn't enforce their rule. There's also a rebellion in 755 that weakened the dynasty. Outsiders such as the Uyghurs came in, and the equal field system deteriorated, and peasants were kind of pissed off. Also, there were regional military commanders who sort of just commanded their own regions and broke off as well. So the final dynasty we'll talk about this time was the Song dynasty. And the Song dynasty really wanted to emulate the previous two, which were kind of like China's golden years, but it didn't really work out. They had lots of weaknesses. For example, they had financial problems, and this combined with an enormous bureaucracy and a high salary, devoured the surplus that they had built up. There were also military problems, of course, civil bureaucrats in charge of military forces, and also external pressures, so like the Jurchen in Korea moved in, and ultimately the Song were forced to move south and rule South China until 1279. So an important thing to remember, as we always do, is to remember the dynasties of China from the beginning because they're always tested. Basically, we have the the XSZ, so the first three we learned, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties. Then we have the Qin Han, and now we can tack on three more: the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. So those are the things you need to remember for this time around. Also, economically, there were lots of developments, such as fast ripening rice that increased food supplies, and there were also new agricultural techniques. So this really sort of helped China to get in front. Also, they developed, of course, their patriarchal social structure, which became really well known. So they had ancestor worship. It became really more elaborate the belief in the spirits and the people that came before them. And also important to this time was foot binding. So this is something that you really need to know came in this time period and this time period only, so don't use this for any other time period in China because it will be wrong. Basically, women were deemed to be more like attractive if they bound their foot, and this was really bad, of course, because it deformed a lot of women later on. So there were also technological and industrial developments as well. There was porcelain, of course, known today as China, because it was developed there. This diffused rapidly, and metallurgy was available more often as well, of course. We also see that gunpowder started to be used in primitive weapons and diffused across Eurasia, so that's how the Europeans got their hands on it. Also, printing got better. So as you may remember, there were the engraved wood blocks, and they moved to movable types, so it made printing a lot easier. There was also naval technology, south-pointing needle, so the magnetic compass, of course, invented in China as well. Also, this market economy was really ahead of the times. So there were financial instruments such as flying cash, so these were basically like checks and paper money. And there was also this developed cosmopolitan society with merchants and foreign merchants in these large cities. Culturally, there were changes in the Tang and Song dynasties. Of course, Buddhism came in, as we talked from the last videos, but there were also foreign religions that sort of didn't really get a hold, and these were Nestorians, Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, and Muslims, of course. And then there was the Silk Road, so that was basically the biggest transmitter of these new religions. So Buddhism in China especially had a big attraction because of its moral standards and intellectual sophistication and salvation it offered to the people. Monasteries that were built really became the large landowners of these societies, and they helped the poor and needy of the community. But they also posed a challenge to the Chinese cultural tradition, as we learned last time, Taoism and Confucianism. So Buddhism and Taoism sort of got along a little better because the Chinese monks used Taoist vocabulary to sort of convert people syncretized to Buddhism, such as Dharma and the Tao, the Way, of course. And also, they sort of really sold the teaching that one son in a monastery could benefit the whole family for 10 generations. So, like, if you were a poor family, this was really attractive. There was also Chan Buddhism, and this was a syncretic faith in which basically Buddhism took Chinese characteristics. There was also the Chan or the Zen in Japanese, and it was basically a popular Buddhist sect that really gained a lot of momentum at this time. Also, his hostility to Buddhism from the Taoists and Confucians continued because Buddhism, of course, was from India, and it was seen sort of as a threat to the native religions. And even though it was persecuted, it survived because it was simply popular. Also, Neo-Confucianism took place, and this was basically the Buddhist influence on Confucianism. So Confucianism, early on, it focused on practical issues of politics and morality, but later on, it started to draw inspiration in like logic, metaphysics, stuff like that from Buddhism that weren't there before. So more syncretism with Neo-Confucianism. So China itself influenced East Asia as well, particularly Korea and Vietnam. So Korea entered into a tributary relationship with China, of course, so they had to pay tribute to China. And the Korean elite really modeled after China, so they turned to Neo-Confucianism, while the peasants turned to Chan Buddhism, so adopting these beliefs from China. Also, the aristocracy and royal houses dominated Korea. And in Vietnam, a similar thing happened. Basically, the Vietnamese people, they took Chinese agriculture, schools, and thought and made it their own. Also, they had a tributary relationship, but many Vietnamese also, on the other hand, retained their religious traditions. They didn't take the Chinese, and women had a much better role than the women in China, of course. So, and of course, the final thing is the Chinese influence in Vietnam was the bureaucracy and Buddhism that were instituted as well. So out of Korea and Vietnam, definitely Vietnam took more from China than Korea, but both were heavily influenced. There was also early Japan, which was also extremely heavily influenced, of course, right across the ocean. And basically, it was there were two periods. The first was Nara, Japan, and of course the earliest inhabitants of Japan were nomadics from Northeast Asia, so they were really just Chinese. And they came over to Japan and they built a new capital called Nara. It was modeled after Chang'an and, of course, the Tang dynasty, as we saw above. And they adopted some Confucianism and Buddhism, but they also had their Shinto rites. Shintoism is going to play a really big role. It's basically this distinctly Japanese religion based on spirits. So something you can definitely use in your essays, Shintoism. Also, after that was the Heian Japan, and basically they moved to a new capital, modern-day Kyoto. And there were emperors, but they were really just ceremonial figureheads and symbols of authority, so they didn't really have a ton of power. They also took Chinese learning, much like the Vietnamese did, and they developed education and political thought. A big deal of this time was the Tale of the Genji, so this was the story written by a woman, and it was really important because sort of at this time it showed that women could have a thought and say as well, just like men. Also, there was the equal field system, and of course, there were powerful clans who engaged in wars. There was also the shogun, who was the military governor, so he was sort of the most powerful in the land. And basically, medieval Japan was a period of decentralization after these centralized empire. And there was the development of the samurai, which were professional warriors of provincial lords, and these valued loyalty, military talent, and discipline. And they really observed a code called the Bushido, and sometimes this included stuff like to preserve their honor, they had to engage in ritual suicide called seppuku. So these were really just interesting people in Japan who ruled at this time. So this has been Chapter 15, The Resurgence of Empire in East Asia. I really recommend you remember these dynasties of China in order because they're always really important, even on the AP exams. So it's basically the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties, followed by the Qin Han. And as we learned in this video, 3 more, the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.